Okay, so today's session is about the introduction, and this comes after talking about how to structure your abstract in the last discussion. Um, how do we approach introduction is what I aim to unfold through this presentation. And I talk about the introduction as a process. So, again, this is not the end of everything in the sense that this is how an introduction should be structured. Instead, think of it as a process that this is how you may start writing or think of your introduction as. Just a second. Yeah. So, in this session, we'll talk about how to distinguish topic from research problem, how to identify gaps in existing research, how to articulate scholarly stakes, and how to write clear and persuasive introductions. Now, when I talk about introduction, I think of an introduction as an inverted pyramid. And I'll come back to this concept once again, once I'm through talking about the introduction. But do remember this concept of inverted pyramid. So a pyramid, as you all know, is like a triangle with the tip pointing upwards. An inverted pyramid would be something that is inverse. So we have the base at the top and the tip towards the end. So that is the image I want all of you to keep in mind as we approach introductions. Now, what is an introduction? A simple definition. In academic essays, introductions and conclusions are the first and last impressions of your paper. And much like in real life, you should always leave a good first and last impression to make your paper stand out. Again, very, very important because if you do not I'm not thinking about a really breathtaking first line or a breathtaking introduction, but a very clear introduction. If your academic paper doesn't have a very clear introduction, it fails to leave an impression on potential readers and potential scholars of your scholarship. So, the scholarship that you're producing for a particular audience. And if your introduction of whatever project it is that you're working on, be it a journal article, be it your dissertation, if it is not clearly pronounced, you won't find a lot of readers, no matter how good your scholarship is. And that's very true. If you approach an academic paper, or if you look at a book or any text for that matter, if you are not taken in by the introduction, the chances are rare that you give it another go or give it a second chance. So, do think of your introduction as the first way through which you make an impression on your potential audience. Now, what is an introduction? An introduction is the most effective paragraph of the paper. Again, tying back to the theme that if your introduction doesn't leave an impression, it fails to leave an impact. It fails to be effective. What does an introduction do? An introduction introduces the central theme or the idea of your paper. It also sets the scene and it also states the thesis of the paper. And I'm talking in terms of paper, dissertation, anything that you're working on. So, any scholarly text, any scholarly corpus that you're dealing with, your introduction should be effective. It should introduce the central theme or idea of the paper. It should set the scene and it should state the thesis of the paper. Uh, a tip here is remember that an introduction is the WHAT, the what of your paper or your academic project. And if you remember this clearly, you will know what to write in your introduction. And that's very true. If you just look at the last 3 points, the central theme sets the scene and states the thesis of the paper. This is basically the what of your project. What is this project about? What is this paper about? Although the methods differ between sciences and humanities, the rhetorical logic of introductions is remarkably similar. And why is it similar? Because the key question that an introduction answers is why does this research need to exist? What is the need of this research? What is this research doing? Okay. And this is common across disciplines, be it the sciences, be it the humanities. Now, when I talk about topic and research problem, an introduction doesn't introduce the reader to the topic. It introduces the readers or the scholars to the research problem. And very subtly put, what is the difference between a topic and a research problem? A topic is a very broad subject, and a research problem is a specific question. A topic is descriptive, a research problem is analytical. A topic concerns the field area, and a research problem concerns an intellectual puzzle. A lot of times we fall into the habit of talking about a topic in the introduction. Do not do this. Topic is broad. What is it from the topic that you are talking about should be mentioned in the introduction. So basically, what is a research problem? Your topic plus the unresolved question plus the scholarly tension. That is your research problem. It is as specific as possible. It is not at all broad. For example, a topic could be Kafka and bureaucracy, but a research problem would be how does the trial anticipate modern theories of administrative violence and legal opacity? Now, this is a topic from the humanities, from literature. One possible topic from sciences could be where it concerns the climate change and agriculture. And a research problem that arises from this particular topic is how will rising nighttime temperatures affect rice yields in South Asia? So, here you know what is happening. The topic is broad, Kafka and bureaucracy. This cannot be a research problem. This cannot go in your introduction. What goes in your introduction is your research problem, which is specific. How does the trial anticipate modern theories of administrative violence and legal opacity? So, this is one important distinction that you need to make as you start approaching your introduction. Now, an introduction also addresses a research gap. Now, what is a research gap? A research gap is something existing scholarship has not adequately explained, tested, or interpreted. Do remember that a gap is not always and is rarely nobody has studied this. Instead, it is how existing work is incomplete. So do not take the pressure of finding out something that no one has studied. In fact, from the existing scholarship, find out what has not yet adequately been explained or tested or interpreted, or how that makes the existing work incomplete. That is a research gap. And that is also something that goes in your introduction because that is why I would like to take or I would like to read your research project. If I don't know what gap what your research project is doing, I wouldn't bother reading it. And where do you put it? You put it in the introduction. Now, what is a gap? There are many types of gaps also. The types of research gaps that exist are empirical gap, when data or evidence is missing, which means that existing research studies climate impacts globally, but little empirical work focuses on smallholder farmers in South Asia. Theoretical gap, when existing research lacks conceptual explanation. For example, Kafka scholarship often emphasizes existential themes but rarely interprets his work through modern theories of bureaucratic power. And what is a methodological gap? When existing research uses limited methods. So, previous AI diagnostic tools rely mainly on imaging data but rarely integrate clinical history and patient metadata. So, these are the types of gaps that you can incorporate in your research. Again, going through it, empirical gap. theoretical gap, or methodological gap. Now, once you have identified those gaps, how do you identify or how do you establish the scholarly stakes in your introduction? Stakes explain why solving the research problem matters. They answer, what difference does this research make? And that's true. You are researching a particular topic because you know that it is going to make a certain difference. It is either going to add value to something that exists, or it is going to talk about something that has not been studied yet, right? So all of us have certain stakes in our project where we know that, okay, solving this or thinking about this problem will help us understand something else, right? So what does a scholarly stake answer? What difference does this research make? And these can be practical, methodological, or conceptual stakes. Again, these can be tied back to the previous gaps. Once you have identified those gaps, you know that whatever you will be researching will be through those gaps and will emphasize stakes through those parameters, right? So if you've identified a methodological gap, chances are that you are going to take a methodological approach and your research is going to make a methodological difference to the problem that exists, the one that you have identified. So this is also something that goes in your introduction very clearly. Now, once you have identified all of these stakes, gaps, and questions, start mapping out the questions that you are planning to answer. These are a lot of whys, right? These are a lot of whats. Now, how do you streamline these? Especially when you have to start writing the introduction. So, the first question that you should concern yourself with is, what is the central theme of the paper? Out of everything that you have identified, what is the central theme that has emerged? Then, which questions are you aiming to answer in the paper? Now, depending also on your methodology, on your training, what are the kind of questions that require immediate response or immediate research, and one that you are capable of carrying within your discipline? Do you have points to support your argument? Very important. Even if you have a lot of questions and you do not know how to answer them, your research falls flat. So identify questions to which you have a solution for, or you have arguments in defense of. Now, another interesting perspective to consider is, do you have an intriguing instance or a vivid anecdote to substantiate your view? Now, this is something that is also debatable in the sense that sometimes a research paper might consider your voice in the sense where you can position yourself personally. If that is the case, then you can start your paper through an instance or through an anecdote. This is true for most blog posts. So, if you are writing a blog post, for example, for a public facing audience, or if this is a scholarly blog, right? You can actually start with an intriguing instance or a vivid anecdote. It's a very good approach of starting an introduction because you get the hook right. You get the audience hooked through a personal narrative. But again, something that you might want to check in academic writing, because this is usually something that is not highly entertained in academic writing yet. So this is something that you might want to consider when you're writing blog posts or reports or something that is for the public. Now, list out the questions you are aiming to answer. The entire paper will be answering that question, introduction being the beginning to that end. Lay out the context of the paper, a thesis that will be answer to your central question, and an outline that will facilitate the reader in understanding the areas that will be explored in the paper. Now, why is the last point important? Because this will give you a straight deep dive into writing the body of your research paper once you have consolidated your introduction. So it's very important that before you start writing your introduction, you also have an outline ready. Why so? Also, because do remember that your introduction is not absolute. Once you have an outline, you can go back to your introduction and also edit it according to the shape that the body of your paper takes. Okay. So there is a symbiotic relationship between the body and the introduction of your corpus. The introduction can be tweaked according to how your paper progresses, and the paper can also be tweaked. By paper, I mean the body can also be tweaked according to the tone that you establish in the introduction. Okay. So do not consider either of these entities as absolute. However, it is important to consider the introduction as an important component before you start writing the body, because that will give you a sense of direction. You will know sure shot that okay, this is what I'm going to do, right? And this paper is not an exercise in free writing. No. Bigger picture now has to be related to your topic. When opening with a sentence that has a broader perspective, question yourself on it. How broad is that perspective? Can this perspective be limited to cater to the context of the essay? Okay. Again, repeating myself, don't hesitate to write a tentative introduction. Do not think that, okay, this introduction that I have written is absolute. Now there's no going back. Start with a tentative introduction. In fact, that is the most important advice I would like to give to everyone present here. Start with a tentative introduction. Do not treat that introduction as absolute. However, ensure that all the key components have gone into that introduction. Basically, the gap, the stakes, and the thesis question. Okay. Now, another important point is writing the introduction in the end is generally helpful. And this is what I meant to have the image of the inverted pyramid in mind. But I'll come back to this again after two, three slides, and you will know why I said this. I would say not writing the introduction, but polishing the introduction in the end is generally helpful, because then you will know that, okay, maybe this is not the way to start my introduction. Maybe I can begin with, say, data, particular data. So you can go back to your introduction after writing the entire paper to change also how you begin the introduction, to change the first few lines of your introduction, and this is what I call the hook, to get the hook right. Okay. So suppose you're writing your paper and you come across an interesting data that you feel can be incorporated right at the introduction to get your readers really engrossed in your paper. Do that. Do that after you are done writing the paper. You have completed the paper. And the most important thing, be straightforward and confident. Again, going back to the previous session, where in the abstract I told you that there's no need to write, I will attempt. No, this you've already done your research. You have to be confident. Just say, this paper looks at. So sound confident, be straightforward. Your paper, your scholarship exists because you have already done the work. You're not attempting to do anything. Your attempts have been successful, and that is why this paper exists. That is why this scholarship exists. Give yourself credit by writing confidently and being straightforward, both in the abstract and in the introduction. Yeah. Positioning the article within scholarly debates. Continuing what an introduction should do, an introduction should situate the paper within existing scholarship or conversations. Again, going back to the research gap, You know you have identified those, you know what already exists, and you know what needs to be added. So, this is sometimes called entering the scholarly conversation. Make sure to signpost it in your introduction. Now, this is an example and how you can actually go about it. So, this is an example from the sciences. Your move one is field context in the sense you feel the context for your paper. You write, you contextualize. Researchers have long studied the relationship between rising temperatures and crop yields. Now, after this, you can introduce your limitation. However, most studies focus on daytime temperatures. And then pitch in your intervention. This study investigates how nighttime warming affects rice productivity in South Asia. Okay, so this is just an abstract from the introduction. This is not your complete introduction. Okay, this is just a pitch to set to for you to see that okay, this is how I have to establish my gap, my scholarly stake in the introduction. Example from the humanities. Now, again, going back to the example of Kafka, where you contextualize. Kafka's The Trial has frequently been interpreted as a reflection of existential anxiety. Then you pitch in the limitation. Yet, such readings often overlook the novel's legal and bureaucratic structures. And then you mention your intervention, why your scholarship is necessary. This article argues that Kafka anticipates modern theories of administrative power. Now, again, pay attention to how this is confident. The tone is extremely confident. It doesn't say that this article will attempt to argue. No. It says this article argues that Kafka anticipates modern theories of administrative power. So, what does this tell us? This tells us that a strong introduction must move from topic to research problem. Again, if I were to go back to show you this example, the Kafka's The Trial has frequently been interpreted as a reflection of existential anxiety. Yet such readings often overlook the novel's legal and bureaucratic structures. You know that a topic has been selected, but more than that, we have also started talking about the specifics. You identify a gap in existing research, which was basically the limit in the previous example, the limitation. Demonstrate why the research matters, and position the study within scholarly conversations. These are the four essential components that your introduction should answer. Okay. Now, before I go on to show you an example of an introduction, these are some don'ts that I would suggest you follow so as not to write a bad introduction. A filler introduction. Now, when I said that do not treat your introduction as absolute, I also did not mean that you only have an introduction for the sake of an introduction. So do not have a filler introduction. Don't write the introduction for the sake of it. Ask the right questions, and it will be easier for you to map your introduction. Make sweeping statements or generic claims. Do not do this. And this exists in the previous examples, okay? Uh, do not write researchers say. If you have to, tell me who are these researchers, okay? So mention those researchers. Do not make sweeping statements or generic claims. Do not do that. Be as specific as possible. The dictionary introduction. Now, this is something that most of us fall prey to. Do not start with the dictionary meaning of a term. Do not do that. We are no longer in grade 4 or grade 5 where we start with the dictionary meaning of a term, right? That was usually a practice when we were writing essays in school. Do not do this now. You are well into writing your PhDs or MPhil dissertations. So remember, you're not going to do something that you did in school. Dictionaries aren't the final sources for writing an academic paper. Refer to dictionaries to understand a term. Don't copy paste from a dictionary. Report format. Very important. Your introduction should not follow a report format. It's not a report. It has to be specific, it has to ask the right questions, and it has to tell me why this research matters. Remember, you have to get the reader interested and engaged in the general topic. That is why you have the hook. You go from general to more specific. Again, going back to the idea of choosing a topic and then moving towards your research problem. So you go from general to more specific. Narrow down your topic so that you can introduce a thesis statement without too much of an abrupt jump between hook and the specifics of your paper. And this is exactly where I would want you to think of the introduction as an inverted pyramid. So you move from general to more specific. Okay. Give your thesis statement, very important. If I do not know what your paper is doing in the first paragraph itself, chances are likely that I'm not going to read your paper. Okay. So give me your thesis statement. Give me what is at stake in your paper right in the first paragraph, right in the introduction. So, what is your thesis statement? Basically, what your paper will explain or argue and the main points. Now, uh, take 2 minutes to read this. And again, I don't want, maybe you can do it as a personal exercise for yourself. This is a very small introduction, and I want you to just read it and see where the hook ends, where the writer begins to narrow, and what the thesis statement is. Okay, so just take 2 minutes to read it. I'll read it out loud later, but take time for your own self. Read this and decide what is the hook, where does it end, where does the writer begin to narrow down? And what is the thesis statement in this sample introduction? Okay, I'll just quickly read out the passage for everyone. Celebrating the revolution, French citizens sent King Louis XVI to the guillotine. Every Halloween day in ancient Rome, criminals were executed in the city square. In the 1880s, in an effort to prevent crime in the US, hundreds of bank robbers, horse thieves, and murderers were hanged in front of the public. However, in the last half of the 20th century, the death penalty has faced increasing opposition. Many people, especially members of churches, are against capital punishment, and most advanced countries have eliminated the death penalty. While it is true that the death penalty has some negative points, it is still a powerful and useful tool. Therefore, our society should keep the death penalty to deter crime, to give fairness to victims and their families, and to punish inhuman criminals. Now, again, to understand, this is not the most perfect of introductions, okay? Treat it as an example where you know how to start what the hook is, and how you actually begin to narrow down to figuring out what the thesis statement should be. And I have it solved for you. So, in case you did it for your own self, you can cross check if you managed to get it right. So the hook was celebrating the revolution. French citizens sent King Louis XVI to the guillotine every Halloween day in ancient Rome. Criminals were executed in the city square. In the 1880s, in an effort to prevent crime in the US, hundreds of bank robbers, horse thieves, and murderers were hanged in front of the public. Now, you know that this began with an interesting anecdote, and how that anecdote has now been connected to something in the US, right? So, something that was happening in ancient Rome is connected to 1880s US. Okay, so this is what was meant by an interesting hook, where you have some really cool anecdote to get your audience to hook their attention to your paper. You begin to narrow down. Now, this is where you start to narrow down from the broad perspective or the broad topic to more to the specifics. So you bring specificity in your introduction. However, in the last half of the 20th century, the death penalty has faced increasing opposition. Many people, especially members of churches, are against capital punishment, and most advanced countries have eliminated the death penalty. While it is true that the death penalty has some negative points, it is still a powerful and useful tool. So, this is how you begin to narrow down what your paper is going to do. And then you establish your thesis. Therefore, our society should keep the death penalty to deter crime, to give fairness to victims and their families, and to punish inhuman criminals. Okay, so you have the hook, you begin to narrow down, or you begin to contextualize it to the setting of your paper, and then you establish the thesis. Okay, now this is something for you to try out when you start doing your own writing. You think of your topic and you think of that one research problem within this topic. Then you identify one gap statement and one stakes statement. And then from this, you start writing. And you must follow this format. You move from topic to research problem. You identify a gap in existing scholarship. You demonstrate why the research matters. And then you position the study within scholarly conversations and establish your own thesis statement. Now, this is something that I think you should be doing tomorrow. So, this template will be shared again for your perusal. So don't worry about this, but I'm just like explaining this to you so you know what to do. You have a template of an introduction right here. Again, do understand that this template is not absolute, it can change, but do remember that an introduction should have all these components. Okay. Okay, I'll stop and I'll take questions now. Yes.
Good evening, ma'am.
Hi, sorry, I can't. Can you tell
Anam here.
me?
Anam
Yeah,
here.
right.
Yes.
Hi.
So I have a hi. I have a question. How can we situate our topic into the scholarly conversations? Like, what all should that part of the introduction entail? The scholarly conversations. Can you please expand upon it a bit?
Yeah, okay. So maybe you can begin, as I said, you can begin with an instance, or if your research has certain data, right? You can also start from there. And then go into telling that, okay, this is the scholarship that exists. So maybe you can introduce that, okay, these are two scholars who have talked a lot about this. However, what has escaped their attention is this, right? And this is what this paper is going to do. So this is how you can establish scholarly conversation. in your introduction. You do not need to give away all the arguments, but just by indicating that, okay, this is the scholarship that exists, and perhaps this is what these scholars have talked about, but have not spoken about, say, XYZ. This paper considers this, and this is how I will talk about it. So, this is one way through which you can approach your introduction, especially when you want to bring in scholarly conversation. Again, this is what I mean, I'll reiterate that it's not absolutely important to establish scholarly conversations in the introduction also. If you feel it is very urgent, do that. And the best way would be actually to start with, I mean, my personal favorite is to start with an anecdote. And by anecdote, I don't mean something that has happened to me, but through data or something that has happened in real life. Okay. Maybe a headlines that can be verified, right? So through that, you can dive into the nitty-gritties of the paper. And that actually gets attention also, because you will know that, okay, this is how I'm connecting it to the contemporary times, or this is how my research speaks to what is happening at the moment. I hope this answers your question.
Yes.
Thank
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Anam. Thank you, Sonakshi, for the answer. Anushka has raised their hand. So, Anushka, please go ahead and ask your questions. Meanwhile, I would like to inform everyone that you could put your questions in the chat box or ask them by raising your hand and then unmuting yourself, whatever you're comfortable with, and whatever you might want to bring to the floor in terms of questions. We do have some questions. We'll take them up once Anushka has asked her question.
Hello, good evening. Am I audible?
Yes. Hi.
Hi. So the session was really helpful for me. My question is like I am researching on voter behavior, and like I totally understood how the introduction has to be made and what should be the structure of the research. But my problem is, like you said, that you include anecdote into your introduction that can be experience as well. So, like for me, if I am analyzing role of certain variable that is influencing voter behavior, and I do have some headlines and even visual data like images or campaign posters, so can that be used as anecdote? And if it can be, how would I substantiate it? Won't it be personal and not academic?
Okay, that's a very interesting question. Thanks for that. I would say yes, you can use that data. You can, so what I would suggest is when you say that you have headlines, use those headlines to begin the introduction. Okay? And the
Okay.
data is your evidence that goes in the body of your research paper, not in the introduction, right? So that won't be any bias. That is something that you can state that this is what my research is about and this is through your findings. Okay, so your findings will come in the body of the paper, not in the introduction. What actually works well in your case would be headlines, and because these headlines are from newspapers which are very well considered scholarly sources, so these won't be personal, this won't be counted as personal anecdote. Okay, this is something that has happened, or this is something that is a phenomena out there in the social world, right? And
Okay.
this is something that you are studying. So you can start with an anecdote from a newspaper or a headlines from a newspaper. And your
Okay.
findings are something that you will substantiate in the body, not in the introduction. You will
Okay.
state that this is something that I will study, or this is something that I prove through my findings or through my fieldwork, and then you give those as your arguments, as evidence, right?
Okay. Okay. Thank you so much.
Okay, welcome.
Sonali, could you start taking up the questions in the chat box? You can start with Payal's question, maybe. We
Sure,
haven't
sure.
taken any yet.
So Payal is asking to explain the inverted pyramid again.
Okay.
No, Sonali,
Uh,
sorry, Sonali. There's a question before that in the beginning. I think you might have missed because you got logged out of the meeting. Uh,
If you can read
Sonali,
it out, Vidushi.
yeah, sure. I'll do it. Sorry. I'm so sorry, Sonali. I thought you were in the meeting. So Payal's first question was, oftentimes it is seen that a research paper starts with a quote separately. Then the first paragraph starts. This method is quite celebrated in literary studies related research papers. Can you kindly let us know what is the use of such a method and how to use such a method, and link such quotes to the main introduction or the writing? If we wish to use this kind of method, what is the right way to do it?
So this question, I like using quotes as well for my research articles. So what I usually do is that I pick up a literary quote that speaks to my thesis statement. So for example, I can talk about my own research and just bear with me. I won't talk much about it, but my thesis was around discard studies, and there's this book by Brian Thiel. It's called Object Lessons Waste, right? And right in the first chapter, there is a scene where we have Socrates talking to one of his followers. And that scene is very beautifully described. So, what I did was that I took Brian Thill's quotation only to start my introduction. So, I started with that introduction, and then I contextualized this in two lines that, okay, this is basically the essence of this quote. And after that, I wrote why that is necessary, or why that quote kind of resonates with the contemporary times that we are in. So because this was a dissertation around biopolitics and the politics of desire, that quote spoke really well after I had established the context. So what I would suggest is that if you want to start with a quote, make sure to not choose a random quote. Choose a quote that fits really well with the keyword of your thesis statement, or the key idea of your thesis statement, or the key theme of your thesis statement. Contextualize it very briefly. And when you're contextualizing, remember, don't give me the introduction of your novel or the literary work that you're studying. Just give me the context why that quote resonates, and through that, link it or establish your thesis statement. Okay. So if you remember these three things, using the quote to establish the key idea or the key theme or the key word of your thesis statement, you're good to go. That's how you can actually use a quotation very well right in the introduction of your paper. I hope this answers your question, Payal.
Uh, yes, Sonakshi, thank you so much. I'll read the second question, or Sonali, you can go ahead because now you might have the messages popping up. That's the second question that Payal has put on the box about inverted pyramid.
Yes, I think Sonakshi, you can go ahead.
Yeah, I think the question is about the inverted pyramid, right?
Yes.
It's very brief. So pyramid is usually like this. An introduction has to be like when I said that the introduction is an inverted pyramid, I meant it's the base is here and the point is here. So basically, introduction, you start with something which is broad, and then you come down to something which is specific, which has a point, which is basically you have the context, and by the time you come to the end of your introduction, which is the tip, you have the thesis statement clearly spelled out. So this is the inverted pyramid image that I had in mind. I hope this answers your question and clarifies doubts. So just remember, introduction, you start from something general, which could be a quote from a book, a chapter, or whatever it is, to establishing its specificity to the thesis statement or the key idea of your paper. So that's the inverted pyramid that I had in mind.
Uh, the next question is from Dr. Abil Mazumdar. If there is something hook-worthy in the literature on the uh, research topic, can that feature in the introduction in relation to the specific topic?
Of course, definitely. That's actually a very brilliant move in the sense you have figured out something which is very hook worthy. You can say that in XYZ novel, there is an instance where, right? And that really gets the audience hooked. You have brought the audience to a particular, like you've drawn their attention to a particular instance. So that also works. Okay. So you just think of it as that instead of a quote, you have an instance from a book which is hook worthy, and it also works that way. So feel free to do that as well in your introduction. But I have like my only caveat would be that this would be applicable mostly to literary studies, where you're talking to a lot of where you're thinking of a lot of books. And if you are, say, thinking of, say, pol science or history, make sure that these instances then are not from books which are not widely read, right? So these are books that most people would have common knowledge about also. So just practice that caution. That is like something that I would be cautious about.
I think we are done with the questions from chat box. If anybody from the audience have any more questions, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask the question directly.
Hi, it's Payal. Ma'am, explain how the quote should be used and how should be contextualized, how it should be contextualized, and then we should write the essence of the quote and then link it to your thesis statement. So, if ma'am can kindly show some example of that kind of method, then that would be great. Just like she has shown us the example of an introduction. So just like that, if she can she can show the show an example of that kind of method where the quote is used and then it has been contextualized and then linked to the thesis statement.
Okay. I don't have an example right now to show, but is it okay if I actually share it with Sonali and Vidushi and you can share it with everyone?
Sure, we can
Absolutely
share
all
it
right.
in today's on tomorrow's session.
Yeah, I can share it and this can be circulated. So I don't mind. It could be like, yeah, because I have to pull up my paper.
Absolutely, Sonakshi, this works
That
well.
can,
So
yeah,
we
yeah.
will circulate it over mail as well as show it in tomorrow, share it in tomorrow's session. So Payal, you could please refer to your mail for that. And also if you join tomorrow's session, we could have a discussion and carry that forward if you so wish to do that.
Yeah, I'll be joining tomorrow.
Okay,
We have
I'll make
two.
sure to share it. Yeah.
Sure. Thank you, Sonakshi. We have two more questions from the audience. Prince is asking how to situate paper within existing conversation when doing a micro study or being the first to intervene, that is on a regional level.
You have answered your own question, Prince. In the sense you stated that no attention has been given to this particular region, and this study then considers this. Okay, so this is how you can intervene. Just bring out what is lacking or what has not been paid attention to. So in a way, you have by asking this question only answered your own question. So this is how you actually situate your paper. Bring out the conversation that have existed at the macro level and why has there been no conversation at the micro level, and why it is important to draw attention to these places, right? So that is how you can contextualize your introduction and establish your research there. Okay, I hope this answers your question. Okay,
We
I
have
think
a second
Arya.
question from Arya.
Yes,
Uh,
of course. Of course, please do. You have to mention from where and whose words, right? Because that would, if you don't, that would be counted as plagiarism. So mention whoever has said that and from wherever place you have taken that from. As long as you have borrowed someone's ideas, words, or works, give them credit. Okay? Be it a quotation, be it just two lines, but remember to cite and quote them.
we have another question from Vijay Pal sir. Madam, any other point regarding difference in introduction with respect to blog posts or public facing articles and research paper?
My only suggestion would be that if you're writing for a public facing audience, you can reduce the load of the jargons. And maybe also if you are writing a blog, a blog post, you can actually have a very strong I voice. By I voice, in the sense, I mean the personal narrative can be very strong instead of it being in the research papers, right? You do not usually talk about personal narratives in research papers. That's usually not the practice. So that is something that you may keep in mind or consider when you're writing for a blog post, as opposed to something which you're doing for research or for a research journal.
I have another question. Can I ask it?
Sure, Payal, go ahead.
Okay, so I am concerned with literary studies research paper because I am from the literary English literature background. So my question is, when I'm writing down the introduction, where exactly should I introduce my primary text, that primary novel or primary poem that I'm going to textually analyze in the entire paper, and how to weave the introduction of the text to my primary thesis statement, as well as the research problem and other things that you mentioned that should be there in the introduction.
Okay, so there are different approaches for this. Okay, if you are starting with a quote, you can very well start by introducing the novel itself because the quote is from the novel, I'm assuming, right? So that is way one. You can start by talking about by contextualizing the quote, by giving me the name of the novel, why this novel is important to be studied, what has been understudied, all of it, right? That is one of the safest ways through which we actually write introductions in literary studies. The other way could possibly be where you don't have an anecdote or where you don't have a quote. For example, you can actually start with a broader problem, and that is where the inverted pyramid comes in play. You can start with a broader problem. So you can start with something like going back to the topic, again, going back to the presentation which I just showed, where you had the topic as Kafka and bureaucracy, right? So maybe a few lines about how bureaucracy figures, maybe as a character in itself in Kafka's novels, right? And then you can introduce certain scholars who have talked about it, or the general reception of Kafka's works with respect to the illustration of bureaucracy for that matter, right? And once you have that, you can transition to however, which is basically a method to introduce your means of establishing your own scholarship by saying that, okay, this much has already been talked about. This is something that we already know. What is yet to be established or what has yet not been talked about is this. And to that effect, this project considers Kafka's, say, The Trial or The Castle, America, whatever it is that you are working with respect to Kafka, that. Okay. And then you can start that, okay, this is what my paper will look at, or in this paper, I argue that Kafka's fiction has been talked about in this sense, but this is how bureaucracy features and all of it. So, this is another way that you can actually go about it. So, you can move from the broad topic to something more general if you do not want to begin with an anecdote or a quote for that matter. And again, do remember an introduction ideally should not go beyond 200 words. Even 200 words is too much. Usually, we tell our undergrad students and our postgrad students to not go beyond 150 words in the introduction, right? So, and this is in terms of the paper that I'm telling you. Of course, if this is like a dissertation, then an introduction should ideally not be more than 2 pages. And this is here, I mean, here it's here where you can bring in more conversations or more scholars, what they've already established, and how you kind of do not agree with them. And that is something that you explore in this thesis. So, again, 2 ways that you can go about. I hope this
Uh,
answers your question.
yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. So basically, the literature review part, a brief literature review kind.
Brief,
Okay.
very brief, very brief. Yes, yes.
Yeah, okay, okay. And also the introduction part, I have seen oftentimes that it goes beyond 1,000 words. Um, and then the main sections, the body sections come. So we can like because abstract would be only of 200 or 250 words, right? So can we like lengthen in the introduction to 1,000 words or something like that?
Said that this is something that would also depend on your supervisor, right? So consider their advice and what is basically good practice within your department. It also varies from department to department. So when I was telling you about my experience, this is coming from like a from Ashoka University, and this is like for a paper, right? So it varies. And when I was writing my dissertation, I was told not to go beyond 1 page for my introduction. So my introduction actually didn't go beyond 250 pages, to be honest. So again, I would say double check with your committee. I think that's the only foolproof way to get everything right in terms of length and word count.
Are there any more questions from the audience? Um, I think we are done with the question and answer round. If not, I can conclude. We
Uh,
can conclude today's session. Anyone?
okay, just last thing.
Yes.
If in the last session when ma'am was speaking about how to write an abstract, she mentioned certain resources, I think, from where we can learn how to write an abstract or something like that. So, if she can suggest any resources from where we can learn how to weave an entire paper or how introduction should be woven into the next section and the next section would be woven into the another next section. So basically how to structure as well as how to weave your argument throughout the paper. So if there is any resources on that.
Sure, I'll pass on the resource list also to Sonali and Vidushi, and they can share it with everyone if that works. Yes.
Okay, thank you, Payal, for suggesting to share the resources. Now I think we can conclude today's session. Thank you so much, Sonakshi, for such a thorough guiding session on how to write introduction. And I think that is very important aspect of whole research writing, and especially when it comes to writing a journal article.